mud-brown cardigan, wire-rimmed glasses deliberately smeared with thumbprints, hair heavily greased down at the roots with a fistful of cheap, unwashed leave-in conditioner. Lydia looked like a walking cry for help, and that was exactly the point. She was supposed to meet the son of her father's biggest creditor, ruin the night through sheer repulsion, and go home to her miserable microwave dinner. But the man waiting at the corner booth didn't sneer. He didn't politely excuse himself. He just watched her approach and smiled. Sweat pooled uncomfortably at the base of Lydia's spine, sliding down her back in a cold, tickling track. The mustard-yellow polyester turtleneck she had fished out of a Goodwill bargain bin was actively suffocating her. It smelled faintly of mothballs and someone else's damp basement, a scent she had tried to mask by aggressively rubbing a cut onion on her wrists before leaving her apartment. She paused outside the heavy oak doors of Il Cigno, the kind of hyper-exclusive Italian restaurant where the waiters wore better tailored suits than most mid-level executives. The brass handle felt freezing against her palm. She hated this. She hated her father for his gambling, for his pathetic weeping on her voicemail 3 nights ago, for putting her in a position where she had to play a pawn to clear a $200,000 debt to a loan shark. "Just meet him, Lydia," her father had begged, his voice wet and thick with cheap scotch. "Just a dinner. Augustus is a good boy. If he likes you, they might extend my terms." She hadn't agreed to be liked. She had agreed to show up. Lydia pushed the door open. The immediate blast of over-conditioned air hit her face, carrying the rich, intoxicating scent of roasted garlic, brown butter, and melting beeswax candles. Soft, pretentious violin music hummed from hidden speakers. The maître d' stood at his podium, a tall man with a sharp nose and a sharply clipped beard. When his eyes landed on Lydia, his professional, welcoming smile died an agonizing death. She knew exactly what he saw. A woman in a violently ugly yellow turtleneck, layered under a pilled mud-brown cardigan. A heavy wool skirt in a shade of nauseating olive green that hit at the most unflattering part of her calf. On her feet, she wore scuffed, thick-soled orthopedic nurse shoes she'd bought at a thrift store. She had drawn a faint, dark line of cheap eyeliner between her brows to simulate a unibrow, and purposely let her posture slump until her shoulders practically touched her ears. "Can I help you, miss?" "The kitchen entrance is around the back," the maître d' said, his voice a low, lethal hiss intended to keep the wealthy patrons from noticing the eyesore bleeding into their dining room. "Reservation for table 7, Lydia said, making sure to pitch her voice a little too loud, letting it crack with a nasal twang. "I'm meeting someone." The maître d' physically recoiled, looking down at his leather-bound ledger. He blinked, clearly hoping the name wouldn't match. "Table 7. The Rossi party?" "Yeah, Rossi. Where is he?" The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing over his starched white collar. He didn't argue. He just turned, walking stiffly through the maze of white linen tables. Lydia followed, making sure to drag the heavy rubber soles of her shoes against the hardwood floor. Squeak, scuff, squeak. Heads turned. A woman dripping in pearls gasped softly, pulling her Chanel clutch closer to her chest. Lydia ignored them, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She hated being looked at. Even more, she hated being laughed at. The humiliation was a hot, acidic lump in her throat, but she swallowed it down. This was armor. Ugly, itchy, polyester armor. If Augustus Rossi took one look at her and ran for the hills, her father couldn't blame her. She had shown up. It wasn't her fault the guy didn't find her attractive. They stopped at a secluded corner booth, half hidden by a heavy velvet curtain. "Your guest has arrived," the maître d' murmured, bowing slightly before practically fleeing the scene. Lydia braced herself for the sight of a spoiled, slicked-back mafia brat in a flashy suit. She slouched her shoulders further, jutting her chin out to create the illusion of a double chin, and looked up. Her breath snagged in her throat. The man sitting in the curved leather booth was not a boy. He wasn't Augustus. He looked to be in his late 30s, and he didn't wear a flashy suit. He wore a dark, charcoal grey button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing thick forearms corded with muscle and a sprawling network of faded, black ink tattoos. No tie. No jacket. He was leaning back against the red leather, a heavy crystal glass of amber liquid balanced loosely in his large, scarred hand. His face was a study in harsh lines and shadows, a strong, crooked nose that looked like it had been broken and reset badly at least twice, heavy, dark brows over eyes so intensely black they looked like chipped obsidian. He didn't look like a rich kid trying to play gangster. He looked like the violence itself, quiet and resting in an expensive chair. He didn't flinch when he saw her. His dark eyes dragged lazily over her greased hair, the smudged glasses, the hideous yellow collar, and the frayed skirt. There was no disgust. Not a single muscle in his face twitched. It was worse than disgust. It was complete, clinical observation. "Sit," he said. His voice was a physical weight in the air. Deep, gravelly, worn out at the edges. Lydia's knees locked. Every instinct she had screamed at her to turn around and run back out into the humid city night. But the debt was a chain around her ankle. She threw herself into the booth opposite him. The leather let out an embarrassing, wet-sounding squeak. Lydia snorted, a loud, pig-like sound she had been practicing. Oops, that was the chair. The man took a slow sip of his drink. The ice clinked gently against the glass. He didn't blink. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Lydia reached across the table, knocking over a perfectly folded white linen napkin, and grabbed a piece of crusty bread from the woven basket. She didn't bother with the butter knife. She ripped it apart with her teeth, chewing with her mouth slightly open, making sure to smack her lips. "So," she said, around a mouthful of crumbs, dropping some onto her brown cardigan. "You're Augustus. Dad didn't say you were older." "I'm not Augustus," the man said. He set his glass down. The movement was deliberate, smooth. There was a predatory grace to him that made the hairs on Lydia's arms stand up beneath her sleeves. "Augustus is currently resting in a private hospital with 2 fractured kneecaps." Lydia stopped chewing. The bread turned to ash in her mouth. She forced herself to swallow, the dry lump scratching its way down her esophagus. "Oh, car accident?" she asked, trying to keep the nasal, obnoxious tone in her voice, but she heard the slight tremor. "Disagreement regarding inventory," he replied mildly. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The scent of him washed over her, cutting right through the smell of the garlic and her own onion-rubbed wrists. He smelled like expensive vetiver, ozone before a thunderstorm, and dark roast coffee. It was a grounded, masculine smell that made her head spin. "I took over his accounts, your father's included." Panic flared in Lydia's chest. This wasn't the plan. This wasn't the spoiled son she was supposed to scare off. Who was this? "Well," Lydia said, leaning forward and planting her elbows on the table, invading his space. She let out a heavy, onion-scented breath right in his direction. "I'm Lydia. Nice to meet you. Look, I don't know what my dad promised you, but I'm just here for the free meal. Hope you're paying." He didn't pull back from her breath. His dark eyes flicked down to her mouth, then back up to the smudged lenses of her glasses. "I am paying," he said softly. A waiter materialized out of nowhere, looking terrified. "Signore Rossi, are you ready to order?" Rossi. This was Dominic Rossi, the head of the family, the man who owned half the ports on the eastern seaboard and allegedly buried people in the concrete foundations of the high-rises his legitimate construction companies built. Lydia's stomach plummeted into her cheap shoes. "The lady will have the lobster ravioli with extra garlic," Dominic said, not looking at the waiter, keeping his eyes locked on Lydia. "And a glass of the 15 Barolo. I'll have the ribeye." "Rare." "I didn't say I wanted ravioli," Lydia snapped, aggressively picking a piece of lint off her sweater and flicking it onto the pristine white tablecloth. "You smell like raw onions and cheap anxiety," Dominic observed casually as the waiter vanished. "I thought garlic might balance the palate." Lydia flushed hotly, the heat rising up her neck and staining her cheeks. He noticed the onion. Of course he did. She doubled down, slouching lower, kicking her heavy orthopedic shoe against his shin under the table. She felt him flinch slightly, but his face remained a mask of stone. "Sorry. Long legs?" she lied brightly. "So, Dominic, what's a big scary guy like you doing out with a girl like me? Dad owes you a lot. I don't have a dime. And let's be honest, I'm not exactly a trophy." She gestured wildly to her greasy hair and the drawn-on unibrow. "You're wasting your time." Dominic tilted his head. He reached out, his hand moving slowly, predictably, so as not to startle her. He picked up her hand where it rested on the table. Lydia tried to snatch it back, but his grip tightened. Not enough to bruise, but enough to hold her completely captive. His palm was rough, covered in thick calluses that spoke of manual labor, not just counting dirty money. His thumb, warm and heavy, stroked the back of her knuckles. "You're trying very hard, Lydia," he murmured. The low timbre of his voice rattled in her chest. "Trying what?" "This is me. Take it or leave it." "Actually, please leave it. I have a cat that needs its anal glands, expressed at 9. Dominic's lips twitched. It was the first sign of human amusement he had shown. He looked down at her hand, trapped in his. "You dress like a bag lady," he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a private, intimate hum between them. "You coat your hair in something that smells like industrial floor cleaner. You rub onions on your skin." He turned her hand over, exposing her palm. "But you forgot your hands." Lydia froze. "A woman who doesn't care about herself," Dominic continued, tracing the soft, perfectly moisturized skin of her palm, "doesn't have cuticles pushed back this perfectly. She doesn't have clear polish applied with a steady hand. She doesn't have calluses on her middle finger from holding a pen too tight, which tells me you actually use that accounting degree your father bragged about." He looked up, pinning her with those obsidian eyes. "And she certainly doesn't wear Chanel No. 5 behind her ears. The onion masks it, but when you leaned in..." I caught it. Lydia's heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. She pulled her hand again, and this time he let her go. She yanked it back, hiding it under the table, her fingernails biting into her own thighs. She was exposed. The ugly sweater, the smudged glasses. It was all stripped away by a man who actually bothered to look closely. "So what?" she spat, dropping the nasal twang, her real voice, slightly raspy, defensive, coming through. "I don't want to be here. You're a criminal. My dad is a degenerate. I tried to make myself repulsive so you'd walk away and leave me out of it. Did it work?" "No," Dominic said simply. The food arrived, but neither of them looked at it. The rich smell of truffle oil and seared meat wafted up, mingling with the tension that hung heavy over the table. Lydia felt a profound exhaustion wash over her. The adrenaline of the performance was fading, leaving behind a cold, hollow dread. She took off her smudged glasses, folding them with shaking fingers, and tossed them onto the table. Without the blurry lenses, Dominic's face was even sharper, the predatory focus in his eyes even more terrifying. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly, stripping away the bravado. Her throat felt tight. "I don't have 200 grand. My father doesn't have it. If you're looking for a wife to breed heirs or whatever it is you mafia guys do, look somewhere else. I'm not doing it." Dominic reached for his steak knife. The scrape of the steel against the porcelain plate was loud. He cut a piece of meat, entirely unbothered by her panic. "I don't want a wife," Dominic said, chewing slowly, swallowing before he continued. "I want an auditor." Lydia blinked. "What?" "Augustus was an idiot," Dominic said, resting his forearms on the table again. "He bled my accounts for 3 years before I found out. He used his father's loan business as a front to launder money out of my pockets. I took the business, but the books are a mess. Encrypted, scattered, dirty. I need someone clean to fix them. Someone who isn't connected to my world. Someone who understands numbers." "I'm an accountant for a mid-level paper supplier," Lydia said, her voice incredulous. "I do payroll and quarterly taxes." "You graduated top of your class at Stern," Dominic corrected her smoothly. "You took a dead-end job to stay close to your father after your mother died, trying to keep him out of casinos. You failed at that, obviously." The casual cruelty of the truth stung. Lydia flinched, her teeth sinking into her bottom lip. "Screw you." "I'm offering you a job, Lydia. You're a mob boss. I'm not doing your dirty books. That makes me an accomplice." "You're already an accomplice to your father's fraud," Dominic pointed out softly. "He forged your signature on the collateral documents for the loan. Did you know that?" The floor seemed to drop out from under her. The restaurant sounds, the clinking silverware, the low murmur of wealthy voices, the pretentious violin, all faded into a high-pitched ringing in her ears. Her father forged her name. If Dominic called the debt in, she wouldn't just lose her terrible apartment. She would go to prison. I didn't," she whispered. Dominic's expression softened, just a fraction. It wasn't pity. It was something heavier, something deeply possessive. He reached across the table again. This time, he picked up a clean linen napkin. "Hold still," he commanded softly. Lydia was too stunned to move. Dominic leaned across the table. His sheer size seemed to blot out the light from the overhead chandelier. The heat coming off his body was palpable. He reached out, his knuckles brushing against her cheekbone. She gasped quietly at the touch. It was so incongruous, this massive, violent man touching her with such careful, deliberate slowness. He pressed the napkin to the space between her eyebrows. He rubbed, applying firm pressure, wiping away the dark, cheap eyeliner she had used to draw the unibrow. The friction burned her skin slightly, but she didn't pull away. She was mesmerized by the intensity in his dark eyes, focused entirely on her face. When he finished, he dropped the stained napkin onto his plate. He didn't sit back down immediately. He lingered, his face only inches from hers. She could see the faint silver scar running through his left eyebrow. She could hear his steady, rhythmic breathing. "You don't have to hide from me, Lydia," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that vibrated right through her ribs. "I see exactly what you are. A smart, desperate woman trying to survive a mess she didn't make." "And what are you?" she fired back, her voice shaking, desperate to reclaim some ground. "The knight in shining armor." Dominic laughed, a short, dark sound with no humor in it. "I'm the dragon, Tesoro, and I'm telling you that you belong to me now until the debt is paid, every cent of it." He finally sat back, picking up his glass of Barolo, swirling the red liquid. "Eat your ravioli. You start work on Monday. Dress however you want. But lose the onion." Lydia stared at the bowl of lobster ravioli in front of her. The heavy mustard collar suddenly felt like a noose, and the man across from her held the rope. She picked up her fork, her hand trembling violently. She took a bite. The pasta tasted like ash and garlic, but she chewed. She swallowed. She wasn't going to cry. Not in front of him. Dominic watched her swallow the food, a slow, predatory satisfaction settling into his hard features. She thought she had walked into a blind date to sabotage it. She hadn't realized she was walking into a cage, and the terrifying part wasn't that the door had just locked behind her. The terrifying part was how warm the cage felt, and how Dominic Rossi was looking at her like she was the only real thing in the room. Monday morning tasted like vehicle exhaust and cheap bodega coffee. Lydia stood on the cracked pavement of a shipping yard in Red Hook, staring up at a corrugated metal warehouse that looked entirely abandoned, save for the sleek, black Audi parked near the loading dock. The wind off the East River whipped her hair into her eyes, stinging her cheeks. She wasn't wearing a mustard turtleneck today. She wore a heavy, oversized grey wool sweater that swallowed her shape entirely, thick black trousers, and sensible flat boots. No makeup, no onion. Just the cold, cynical reality that she was reporting for duty to a man who could snap her neck like a dry twig. She pushed open the heavy steel door beside the loading bay. It shrieked on its hinges. Inside, the contrast was violently jarring. The warehouse floor was active, men in work boots moving wooden crates with forklifts, the air thick with the smell of diesel, sawdust, and sea salt. But tucked into the upper mezzanine, enclosed in thick, soundproof glass, was a modern office. Lydia climbed the metal grate stairs, her boots clanging loudly. She reached the glass door and pushed it open. The roar of the warehouse vanished instantly, replaced by the sterile hum of central air conditioning and the faint smell of ozone from a high-end commercial printer. A man sitting at a reception desk looked up. He was entirely bald, with a neck thicker than Lydia's thigh, and a perfectly tailored navy suit that stretched dangerously across his shoulders. He didn't smile. He just pointed a thick finger toward a closed oak door at the back. Lydia walked past him, her stomach a cold, tight knot. She knocked once on the oak door. "In!" a voice rumbled. Dominic's office was devoid of personality. No pictures, no plants, just a massive mahogany desk, 3 filing cabinets, and a wall of monitors displaying shipping manifest data. Dominic stood by a small espresso machine in the corner, pouring a dark, sludgy shot into a tiny ceramic cup. He wore a crisp white shirt today, the sleeves rolled up again, the holster strapped over his chest fully visible. A dull black handgun rested securely against his ribs. Lydia stopped just inside the door, her eyes snagging on the weapon. Her mouth went dry. "Black coffee?" Dominic asked, not turning around. "I have my own," Lydia said, gripping her paper cup so tightly the cardboard buckled, scalding liquid threatening to breach the plastic lid. "Where do I sit?" Dominic turned. His dark eyes swept over her oversized sweater and bare face. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch pulled at the corner of his mouth. "You left the disguise at home, but you're still hiding in a tent, Lydia." "I'm here to do a job, Rossi, not walk a runway," she snapped, dropping her purse onto a secondary desk pushed against the side wall. It was piled high with 6 external hard drives and a towering stack of physical ledger books bound in peeling red leather. "Are these Augustus's?" "The physical ones are Augustus's private records. The drives are the official fronts," Dominic said, walking over and leaning his hip against her desk. He was too close. The smell of vetiver and dark roast coffee immediately invaded her space, overpowering the stale scent of her bodega cup. He kept 2 sets of books, standard practice, but Augustus was a sloppy addict. He started keeping a 3rd set to hide what he was stealing from me. Lydia looked at the pile. Her professional instincts kicked in, momentarily overriding her terror. 3 sets? That's an administrative nightmare. If he was moving money through your legitimate fronts, he'd have to fabricate corresponding invoices. Shell companies, fake vendor IDs. Exactly, Dominic said softly. He reached out and tapped the top red ledger. I need you to find the ghost vendors. Track the decimal points. Augustus bled $4 million over 3 years. I don't care about the money. I care about who helped him funnel it. Lydia booted up the laptop sitting beside the drives. If I find the names, what happens to them? That isn't your concern. It is my concern if I'm handing you a hit list, Lydia said, her voice shaking slightly. She forced herself to look up, meeting his obsidian gaze. I'm an auditor. I'm not a bullet. I don't want blood on my conscience. Dominic stepped closer, crowding her against the edge of the desk. The sheer mass of him blocked out the fluorescent light overhead. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from his chest was suffocating. Your father owes me $200,000, Dominic said, his voice dropping to that rough, intimate gravel. He forged your name. He gambled it away at a table run by my competitors. If I don't get this sorted, my competitors will come for him. And then they will come for you, because your name is on the paper. Do you understand the ecosystem you are in, Lydia? She swallowed hard. The metallic taste of fear flooded her mouth. Yes. Good. Dominic backed away, giving her room to breathe. Find the ghosts. If you need anything, ask Leo. He gestured vaguely toward the glass door where the bald man sat. Don't leave the building without him. Lydia spent the next 9 hours staring at spreadsheets until her vision blurred. The data was a catastrophic mess. Augustus hadn't just been stealing, he had been incompetent. Numbers were shoved into incorrect columns, vendor IDs mismatched, and massive payouts were categorized under vague labels like consulting or site maintenance. Her back ached, her eyes burned. She ate a stale protein bar from her purse for lunch, refusing to ask Leo for anything. By 7 p.m., the warehouse below had gone completely silent. The only sound in the office was the frantic clicking of her mouse and the hum of the hard drive. Dominic hadn't left his desk either. He spent the day taking phone calls in rapid-fire, heavily accented Italian, his voice low and devoid of emotion. At 7:30 p.m., Lydia hit a wall. She cross-referenced a suspicious site maintenance invoice against a physical ledger entry. The dates didn't match. The amounts were off by exactly 10%. 10%. A standard kickback rate. She rubbed her eyes, leaning back in her chair. The leather squeaked. Dominic looked up from his paperwork. You found something. It wasn't a question. I found a pattern, Lydia muttered, massaging her temples. Augustus was paying a company called Apex Solutions. They don't exist in the New York State Registry, but the payments always clear on the 14th of the month, right after your waterfront import stock. He wasn't just stealing cash, he was skimming cargo. Dominic went completely still. The silence in the room suddenly felt dangerous. He stood up, walking slowly to her desk. He leaned over her shoulder, his arm brushing against her oversized sweater. He stared at the screen. Show me, he commanded. Lydia highlighted the cells, her hand trembling slightly as he leaned closer. His chin was practically resting on her shoulder. Here, and here. 4 million is just the cash. If he was skimming electronics or pharmaceuticals off the docks, He stole double that. Dominic didn't yell. He didn't smash anything. He just straightened up, his eyes dead and flat. "Leo!" Dominic called out, his voice carrying easily through the glass. The door opened instantly. "Bring me Vincent," Dominic said. Leo nodded once and disappeared. Lydia looked at Dominic, her stomach performing a slow, sickening roll. "Who is Vincent?" "The dock manager," Dominic said mildly, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. He looked down at her. "Go home, Lydia. Leo will drive you." "I'm not done," she argued, though every instinct told her to run. "I haven't traced the routing numbers. I said go home." The command was sharp, slicing through the air like a blade. Lydia flinched. She grabbed her purse, practically running out of the office. She didn't look back. She didn't want to know what happened to a man who helped skim cargo. She just wanted to go back to her miserable safe apartment. 3 weeks bled into one another, marked only by the endless glow of Excel spreadsheets and the suffocating proximity of Dominic Rossi. Lydia was drowning in numbers, but worse, she was drowning in the contradictions of her own reality. She hated being captive. She hated the armed guards, the burner phones, the locked doors. But her father hadn't called. The loan sharks had stopped harassing her. Her debt, while technically held by a terrifying monster, was entirely managed. For the first time in 10 years, she wasn't panic-checking her bank account to see if her rent check would bounce because her father had stolen her debit card. It was a Tuesday night, raining heavily. The drops hammered against the warehouse roof like thrown gravel. Lydia was alone in the main office, massaging a knot in her neck. Dominic had stepped out hours ago for a meeting. She had finally cracked the routing numbers. The ghost company, Apex Solutions, wasn't funneling money into offshore accounts. It was funneling it right back into the city, specifically into a series of real estate holding companies. The door to the outer office banged open. Lydia jumped, her chair rolling backward. The sound of heavy, dragging footsteps echoed through the glass. She stood up, peering out. Dominic walked in. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His white shirt was soaked, clinging to his heavy frame, plastered to the muscle and the black tattoos creeping up his neck. But it wasn't just rain. The entire left side of his shirt was stained a horrific, sticky, dark red. He was dragging a man by the collar of his jacket. The man was groaning, his face a bruised, swollen mess, blood dripping steadily from his nose onto the linoleum floor. Lydia froze. Her brain completely misfired. She had known, abstractly, what Dominic was. She had seen the gun. She had tracked the stolen millions. But she had never seen the violence, not up close. Dominic hauled the man into the center of the reception area and dropped him. The man hit the floor with a wet thud. Dominic didn't even look out of breath. He turned, his dark eyes locking onto Lydia through the glass. He froze. For a fraction of a second, the cold, dead look in his eyes cracked, replaced by something that looked entirely like regret. Lydia couldn't breathe. The smell hit her immediately. It seeped through the cracks in the door. Copper. Raw, heavy, metallic copper mixed with the smell of wet asphalt. Her stomach violently rebelled. She turned away from the glass, dropping to her knees beside the metal trash can next to her desk, and threw up. Her entire body shook, coughing and retching, the stale coffee and dry toast from breakfast burning her throat. It was humiliating. It was raw. She couldn't stop shaking. The heavy oak door opened. Lydia flinched violently, scrambling backward on her hands and knees until her back hit the filing cabinet. She brought her arms up, crossing them over her face in a pathetic, defensive gesture. Dominic stopped halfway across the room. He didn't come closer. He looked at her, huddled against the metal, shaking like a beaten dog. He looked down at his blood-soaked hands. He walked over to the small sink in the corner, turning the water on. He scrubbed his hands furiously with industrial soap, the water turning pink, then clear. He dried them on a paper towel, his back to her. "Get up," he said. His voice was tired, deflated. "Don't," Lydia rasped, her throat burning, tears of panic spilling hot down her cheeks. "Just don't touch me." Dominic turned around. He picked up a clean paper cup, filled it with cold water from the dispenser, and walked over to her. He didn't crowd her this time. He crouched down 3 feet away, setting the cup on the floor between them. "Drink," he said gently. Lydia lowered her arms slightly, eyeing him like a cornered animal. "Who is that out there?" "The man who owns the holding companies you tracked," Dominic answered, his face an unreadable mask. "He decided to pull a knife when we asked for the paperwork." "Is that your blood?" she whispered, her eyes glued to the dark stain on his shirt. Dominic looked down. "No." Lydia squeezed her eyes shut, letting out a jagged sob. "I can't do this. I can't be part of this. Please, just let me go. I'll figure out a way to pay you. I'll work 3 normal jobs. Just don't make me look at this." Dominic stared at her. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of the rain and her ragged breathing. He didn't offer her sweet assurances. He didn't lie to her. "You can't go back, Lydia," he said, his voice stripped of the intimidating gravel, leaving only a cold, hard truth. "You know too much. You know the fronts, the roots, the names. If I let you go, Augustus's people will kill you to keep you quiet. You think you're safe in your little apartment? You were dead the minute your father signed that paper." Lydia looked at him, the reality settling over her like a suffocating blanket. "I'm keeping you alive," Dominic said, his dark eyes boring into hers. "It's ugly. It's violent. But in here," he gestured to the office, "you are untouched. Drink the water." Lydia slowly reached out, her hand trembling violently. She picked up the cup and took a sip. The cold water shocked her system, settling her rolling stomach slightly. She looked at Dominic, crouched in front of her, stained in violence but looking at her with a fierce, terrifying protectiveness. It was a contradiction she couldn't reconcile. He was the monster under the bed, and he was the one standing guard at the door. The invitation was printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock with embossed gold lettering. A charity gala for a children's hospital hosted at the plaza. It was the perfect, shining cover for the city's elite to mingle with its most dangerous shadows. "You have to come," Dominic had told her 2 days prior. "The board members of the holding companies will be there. I need you to listen. You know the numbers better than I do. Tell me who lies." Which meant she couldn't wear the oversized sweater. She couldn't hide. Lydia stood in front of the floor-to-length mirror in the private suite Dominic had booked at the hotel. She didn't recognize the woman staring back. The dress Leo had delivered earlier that afternoon was a deep, liquid emerald green. It was silk, cut on the bias, clinging to the curves she had spent years burying under wool and polyester. It plunged sharply at the back, exposing the pale skin between her shoulder blades, and draped elegantly over her hips. Her hair, normally pulled into a severe bun or greased flat, had been blown out by a stylist Dominic hired, falling in soft, dark waves over her bare shoulders. Minimal makeup, but enough to accentuate the sharp cut of her cheekbones and the wide, panicked look in her eyes. She looked expensive. She looked like she belonged to him. The door to the bedroom clicked open. Lydia turned, her heart hammering its familiar, frantic rhythm against her ribs. Dominic walked in. He stopped dead. He was wearing a custom-tailored black tuxedo that fit him with lethal perfection. The stark white shirt contrasted sharply against his olive skin and the dark shadow of his beard. He looked less like a thug and more like a dark prince, ruthless and untouchable. But when he looked at her, his composure visibly fractured. His dark eyes dragged over her slowly, taking in the silk, the bare skin, the way her chest rose and fell rapidly with her breathing. The silence in the room grew heavy, electric, charged with a sudden, suffocating heat that had nothing to do with fear. He took a step toward her. Then another. Lydia didn't back away. She couldn't. Her feet felt rooted to the plush carpet. Dominic stopped inches from her. The smell of him, vetiver, clean soap, and that underlying danger wrapped around her. He reached out, his hand hovering over her bare shoulder, before he slowly, carefully rested his palm against her skin. His touch was burning hot. "You clean up well, auditor," he murmured, his voice a low, rough scrape in the quiet room. "It's armor," Lydia whispered defensively, though her voice shook. She forced herself to look up into his eyes. Just a different kind. Dominic's thumb traced the line of her collarbone. "This kind suits you better." He dropped his hand, stepping back, pulling the professional mask back into place, though the tension between them hummed like a live wire. "Ready?" The ballroom was a sensory assault. The overwhelming smell of expensive perfumes, orchids and roasted pheasant made Lydia slightly nauseous. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the polite, hollow laughter of the wealthy grated on her nerves. She stuck close to Dominic's side, acutely aware of the stares they were drawing. Dominic was a known entity here. The whispers followed him like a wake. "Dominic, it's been a while." A man blocked their path. He was tall, thin, with slicked-back blonde hair and a pale, sneering face. Lydia instantly recognized him from a photograph in Augustus's files. Simon, the CEO of one of the corrupt holding companies. "Simon," Dominic said. His voice was perfectly neutral, but Lydia felt the muscles in his arm, where her hand rested lightly, turn to solid granite. Simon's pale eyes slid past Dominic and landed on Lydia. The look was entirely degrading, stripping her bare, assessing her value in dollars and cents. "I see you've replaced Augustus with softer company. Though I must say, bringing the hired help to the plaza is a bit bold, even for you." Lydia felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up her neck. She tightened her grip on her small clutch. Dominic didn't yell. He didn't move fast. He simply shifted his weight, placing himself slightly in front of Lydia, cutting off Simon's line of sight. "She is my chief financial officer," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "And you will look at my face when you speak to me, Simon, or I will remove your eyes and hand them to you." The threat was delivered so calmly, so politely amidst the string quartet playing in the background, that it took a second to register. When it did, Simon's pale face drained of all color. He swallowed hard, taking a rapid step backward. "Apologies, Dominic. A misunderstanding. Enjoy the evening." Simon practically fled into the crowd. Lydia stood frozen. She looked up at Dominic. His jaw was clenched tight, a muscle ticking violently near his ear. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking down at her, checking her reaction, scanning her face for fear. He had protected her. Not just her life, but her dignity. In a room full of monsters in suits, he had drawn a line in the sand around her. Lydia reached out without thinking. Her hand, trembling slightly, grasped the lapel of his tuxedo jacket. The silk was smooth under her fingertips. She adjusted the black silk tie that had gone slightly askew, smoothing her hand down his chest, right over where she knew his holster rested beneath the fabric. Dominic sucked in a sharp breath. His hand came up, wrapping around her wrist, stopping her movement. His fingers were hot against her pulse point. "Don't!" he whispered, his eyes blazing down at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Don't touch me like that unless you know what it means." Lydia looked at his hand holding hers. The cage wasn't just warm anymore. It was burning, and the terrifying realization crashing over her, amidst the clinking glasses and polite chatter, wasn't that she was trapped. It was that she wasn't sure she wanted to leave. Leather creaked loudly in the suffocating quiet of the back seat. The Maybach slid through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, the heavy tint of the windows blurring the city lights into angry red and yellow streaks. Lydia sat rigidly against the door, putting as much distance between herself and Dominic as the luxury car allowed. Her wrist still burned where his fingers had clamped down on her pulse. Dominic stared straight ahead at the glass partition, separating them from Leo, his profile carved from granite in the passing streetlights. He had unfastened the top button of his white shirt and loosened the black silk tie, stripping away the polished veneer of the gala to reveal the raw, dangerous edge beneath. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence was a physical weight, pressing the oxygen out of the cabin. Lydia unclasped her clutch. Her hands were shaking so badly the metal latch rattled. She kicked off the emerald-green stilettos. Her heels were covered in raw, weeping blisters from standing for 3 hours on marble floors. The pain was sharp, grounded, and entirely welcome compared to the chaotic spiral of her thoughts. "Where are we going?" she asked. Her voice cracked, betraying the calm she was desperately trying to fake. "This isn't the way to Brooklyn, or my apartment." "You aren't going to your apartment," Dominic said, not turning his head. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like pennies on the back of her tongue. "Excuse me? You don't get to just kidnap me because I touched your jacket. I have a life. I have—" She stopped. What did she have? A father who sold her out, a miserable job she had already abandoned to audit mob ledgers, and a cat that hated her. Dominic finally turned. The ambient light caught the silver scar slicing through his eyebrow. "Simon knows who you are now. He knows you aren't just a piece of arm candy. You're the auditor. By tomorrow morning, Augustus will know you're the one tearing his ghost companies apart. Your apartment is a ground-floor walk-up with a broken deadbolt, Lydia. You'd be dead before the sun comes up." The bluntness of it knocked the air from her lungs. She looked down at her blistered feet, the emerald silk pooling around her ankles. She felt ridiculously stupid. She was playing dress-up in a world where people actually died. The car descended into a private subterranean parking garage, the heavy concrete walls swallowing the sound of the rain. Leo parked the car and killed the engine. Dominic opened his door and stepped out into the damp, echoing quiet. Lydia hesitated, then grabbed her shoes and followed, walking barefoot across the freezing concrete. They took a private elevator up 40 floors. The pressure popped in Lydia's ears. When the stainless steel doors slid open, they stepped directly into a massive penthouse. It was exactly what she expected, yet entirely jarring. Cold, minimalist, ruthlessly clean. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the storm swallowing the city skyline. The floors were poured dark concrete, the furniture angular and upholstered in black leather. It smelled like cedarwood, expensive scotch, and absolute isolation. Dominic walked straight to a wet bar built into the wall. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass and held it out to her. Lydia dropped her shoes by the door and walked over. She didn't take the glass. "I don't want a drink. I want the truth." Dominic slowly lowered his hand, setting the glass on the marble counter. The soft clink echoed in the vast room. "Which truth?" "My father," Lydia said, crossing her arms over her chest, shivering as the central air bit into her bare shoulders. You said he forged my name on the collateral documents, but that's a $200,000 debt. A loan shark doesn't take the signature of an entry-level accountant as collateral for that kind of money. Not unless there's something else. What did he promise you? Dominic looked at her. For the first time since she met him, he looked hesitant. He turned around, opening a locked drawer beneath the bar. He pulled out a thick manila folder and tossed it onto the marble counter. It slid, stopping an inch from her hand. Augustus approved the loan before I took over his books, Dominic said, his voice stripped of all emotion. It was clinical, flat. Augustus is a degenerate, but he isn't stupid. He knew your father couldn't pay, so he structured the debt differently. Lydia reached out with a trembling hand and opened the folder. The top document was a standard promissory note printed on cheap legal paper. There was her father's messy, looping signature. And right beneath it, flawlessly forged, was hers. But it wasn't just a guarantor signature. She read the clause under the bolded heading, Default Conditions. In the event of total default, the guarantor, Lydia Hayes, agrees to assume the debt in full through involuntary asset forfeiture or directed labor under the creditor's sole discretion, indefinite until the principal and exorbitant interest are satisfied. Lydia's vision swam. The words blurred into meaningless black squiggles. Directed labor. Indefinite. He didn't just forge my name to get the money, Lydia whispered, the horror hollowing out her chest, leaving a vast, freezing ache. He sold me. He literally signed me over to a loan shark as a slave. Yes, Dominic said simply. Lydia's knees gave out. She didn't faint, but her legs simply refused to support her weight anymore. She sank to the cold concrete floor, the beautiful emerald silk crumpling around her. She didn't cry beautifully. A raw, ugly sob tore out of her throat, thick with mucus and years of buried, rotting resentment. She pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in her arms, gasping for air that felt too thin to breathe. Her father, the man she had taken a dead-end job to protect, the man she had bought groceries for, whose gambling debts she had covered by eating ramen for 3 years. He had handed her to the wolves for a stack of chips at a poker table. She felt a sudden, massive warmth envelop her. Dominic didn't pull her up. He didn't tell her it was going to be okay, because it wasn't. He sat down on the hard concrete floor right beside her, ruining the crease of his custom tuxedo trousers. He wrapped one massive arm around her shaking shoulders and pulled her flush against his side. Lydia fought him for a second, her hands pushing weakly against his chest, her knuckles scraping against the stiff cotton of his shirt. But the fight drained out of her instantly. She collapsed against him, burying her face in his neck. He smelled like rain and the faint, coppery scent of danger, but beneath it, he was just solid. He was an anchor in a world that had just violently liquefied beneath her feet. Dominic rested his chin on the top of her head. His large, calloused hand stroked the bare skin of her back, the movement awkward, but fiercely deliberate. "I won't let them collect," Dominic murmured, his voice vibrating against her cheek. "I bought the debt. You belong to my ledger now, and my ledger is closed." It was a terrifying comfort. She was property, transferred from one monster to another. But as she sat shivering on the floor, clutching the lapel of the deadliest man in New York, Lydia realized the darkest contradiction of all. She felt entirely, unconditionally safe. The smell of ozone and old paper was giving Lydia a migraine. She sat at her desk in the glass-enclosed office at the Red Hook warehouse, rubbing her temples with fingers that smelled faintly of printer ink. It had been 4 days since the gala. 4 days of sleeping in Dominic's guest room, eating takeout he ordered, and coming to the warehouse under heavy guard. She had found the final thread. Augustus hadn't just been skimming money into holding companies. He was using the holding companies to buy real estate directly in the path of Dominic's legitimate construction developments, forcing Dominic to buy the land back at hyperinflated prices. It was a closed loop of theft, brilliant if it hadn't been so sloppily executed. Lydia hit print on the final summary report. The printer in the corner whirred to life, spitting out the damning pages. Dominic was down on the warehouse floor, arguing with Vincent over a shipping manifest. Through the glass, Lydia watched him gesture sharply, his face set in hard, unforgiving lines. He was in his element here, a king surrounded by heavy machinery and rough men. She stood up to grab the papers from the tray. The first sound wasn't loud. It was a sharp, metallic ping, like a pebble hitting a tin roof. Lydia frowned, looking up toward the corrugated ceiling. Then the glass wall of the office exploded. It didn't shatter. It disintegrated into 1,000,000 lethal diamonds, blown inward by the concussive force of automatic gunfire. The noise was deafening, a physical, rattling roar that vibrated through Lydia's teeth and shattered the fluorescent lights overhead. Time dilated, moving through thick syrup. Lydia didn't scream. Her vocal cords were paralyzed. She felt a piece of shrapnel bite into her upper arm, a hot, stinging slice, but her brain failed to process the pain. She just stood there, entirely exposed, watching the plaster from the back wall vaporize into white dust. A massive force hit her waist. The air rushed out of her lungs in a violent grunt as Dominic tackled her to the floor. They crashed behind the heavy steel filing cabinets. The floor was filthy, covered in years of accumulated dust and now littered with jagged glass. "Keep your head down," Dominic roared, his voice barely audible over the continuous, deafening crackle of gunfire chewing through the office furniture. He was practically lying on top of her, shielding her body with his own. He smelled violently of sweat, adrenaline, and gun oil. He drew the dull black handgun from his shoulder holster, his eyes wide, feral, scanning the destroyed office layout above them. "Who is it?" Lydia choked out, tasting drywall dust and panic. "Augustus's cleanup crew," Dominic ground out. The muscle in his jaw was twitching so hard it looked like it might snap the bone. "They tracked the printer IP. He knows you finished the audit." A heavy thud echoed outside the office door, followed by a scream that got abruptly cut short. "Leo," Dominic cursed violently in Italian. He grabbed Lydia by the collar of her oversized sweater, hauling her forcefully to her hands and knees. "Crawl to the safe beneath the desk. Now." Lydia scrambled. The glass bit through her thick trousers, scraping her knees, but terror fueled her movements. She dove under the massive mahogany desk. It was reinforced steel beneath the wood veneer. Dominic didn't follow her under. He crouched beside the edge of the desk, raising his weapon. "Stay there. Put your hands over your ears and open your mouth so the pressure doesn't blow your eardrums," he commanded, not looking at her. His focus was entirely on the doorway. 3 men stepped through the shattered frame of the office, their faces obscured by dark balaclavas, holding matte black submachine guns. Dominic didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a warning or a dramatic speech. He simply fired. The sound of his weapon was different, a heavier, deeper boom that shook the floorboards. Lydia squeezed her eyes shut, clapping her hands over her ears, her mouth open in a silent scream as the air pressure violently fluctuated. She smelled the bitter, choking scent of cordite and burning carpet. Hot brass casings rained down, one bouncing off her sneaker, searing the rubber. She heard bodies hit the floor, heavy, dead weight. More shouting from the warehouse floor below. Vincent's crew returning fire. The entire building became a chaotic, echoing war zone. Lydia squeezed herself into a ball, burying her face into her own knees. She was an accountant. She balanced ledgers. She rubbed onions on her wrists to avoid awkward dates. She wasn't supposed to die under a desk smelling of blood and drywall. The firing stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It was ringing, heavy and pregnant with the threat of what was coming next. Lydia opened her eyes slowly. The dust in the air made it look like a thick, grey fog had settled inside the office. Dominic was leaning heavily against the side of the desk. His left arm was hanging limply at his side, blood rapidly soaking the sleeve of his shirt, dripping steadily onto the ruined linoleum. He was breathing hard, the gun still raised, pointed at the doorway. 3 bodies lay motionless in the shattered glass. "Dominic," Lydia breathed, her voice trembling so badly it was barely a whisper. She crawled out from under the desk, ignoring the glass embedding into her palms. She reached for his bleeding arm. He flinched away from her touch, his eyes wild and unseeing for a fraction of a second before they locked onto her face. The feral look slowly receded, replaced by an agonizing exhaustion. He lowered the gun. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his voice rough as sandpaper. "No, just a scratch," she said, looking at the shallow cut on her own arm. She stared at his bleeding bicep. "You're shot." "It's a through and through," he muttered, dropping the magazine from his gun and slapping a fresh one in with his good hand. The mechanical clack was loud in the quiet room. He looked down at her. Her face was streaked with dirt, plaster dust in her hair, her sweater ruined. He reached out, his bloody hand hesitating before he gently wiped a smudge of soot from her cheekbone. His thumb smeared a streak of red across her pale skin. "I told you," Dominic said, his breathing finally slowing down. "In here, you are untouched." He had taken a bullet to keep that promise. Lydia looked up into his obsidian eyes, the fear entirely burned away by a sudden, fierce clarity. She wasn't just a ledger entry to him, and he wasn't just a monster to her. The dragon hadn't just locked her in a tower. He was bleeding on the floor to keep the wolves out of it. The sun broke over the East River, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and sickly orange. The warehouse was quiet, save for the hum of industrial cleaning fans trying to pull the smell of bleach and cordite out of the air. The police had never been called. The bodies had vanished before the sun came up, swallowed by the quiet, brutal efficiency of Dominic's world. Lydia sat in the private kitchen, attached to Dominic's penthouse, nursing a cup of black coffee she couldn't taste. A bandage covered the scratch on her arm. Dominic walked into the kitchen. He wore grey sweatpants and no shirt. His left shoulder and bicep were heavily bandaged, the stark white gauze contrasting against his dark skin and the sprawling ink. He moved stiffly, pouring himself a cup of coffee with his right hand. He didn't sit across from her. He leaned against the marble island, watching her. "Augustus is dead," Dominic said. The words carried no weight. It was just a fact, delivered with the morning coffee. He tried to run when the hit team failed. Vincent intercepted him at Teterboro. Lydia stared into her mug. She didn't feel relief. She didn't feel horror. She just felt numb. "And my father?" "On a plane to Nevada," Dominic replied, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "I gave him $5,000 and told him if he ever crosses the Mississippi River again, I'll bury him under a toll booth." Lydia nodded slowly. Her father was gone. The threat was gone. Dominic reached into the pocket of his sweatpants. He pulled out a piece of paper, folded twice. He tossed it onto the kitchen table in front of her. Lydia recognized the cheap legal paper immediately. It was the collateral document, the forged signature, her enslavement in ink. "The audit is done," Dominic said. The gravel in his voice was thick, forced out through a tight throat. "You found the $4 million. You found the real estate loop. You earned your keep." He reached out and dropped a silver Zippo lighter on top of the paper. "Burn it," Dominic said. "Your debt is paid. The ledger is clean. "You're free to go, Lydia." Lydia stared at the lighter. The cold, heavy metal gleamed in the morning light. This was it. This was the moment she had been praying for since the night she put on the mustard turtleneck and rubbed her wrists with an onion. She was free. She could walk out the door, take the elevator down, and disappear back into a quiet, boring, safe life. No more guns, no more blood, no more looking over her shoulder. She picked up the lighter. Her thumb flipped the lid open. Clink. She struck the flint. The small orange flame danced between them. She touched it to the corner of the contract. The cheap paper caught instantly, curling and blackening, the smoke rising in a thin, grey ribbon toward the ceiling. She dropped it into the ceramic sink, watching it burn down to brittle grey ash. It was gone. She was nobody's property. She looked up at Dominic. He was staring at the ashes, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle looked painful. He was letting her go, and it was tearing him apart. The ruthless, untouchable boss who dragged beaten men through his office and took bullets without flinching couldn't even look at her as she packed up her invisible bags. Lydia stood up. She walked around the table, stopping inches from him. Dominic finally looked down at her, his obsidian eyes guarded, flat, waiting for her to say goodbye. "My apartment is a shoebox," Lydia said quietly, her voice slightly raspy. "And the deadbolt is broken. I really hate it there." Dominic froze. His breathing hitched, a microscopic break in his iron control. "Lydia, don't." "Don't what?" she asked, taking a half-step closer, invading his space, breathing in the scent of vetiver, soap, and the faint metallic tang of his injury. "Don't stay because you think you have nowhere else to go," Dominic warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "I gave you an out. If you stay now, it's not a debt. It's a choice. And I won't let you leave a second time." Lydia reached up. Her hand didn't tremble this time. She pressed her palm flat against his bare chest, right over his heart. It was beating frantically, a heavy, violent rhythm beneath his ribs. She felt the rough texture of the scar tissue near his collarbone. "I tried to sabotage you, remember?" Lydia murmured, tracing the edge of his bandage. "I wanted you to look at me and walk away. But you saw the clear polish. You saw the calluses. You saw me." She looked up, meeting his eyes with a fierce, imperfect resolve. "I'm not an accountant anymore, Dominic, and I don't want to go back to being invisible." Dominic let out a harsh, jagged breath. He dropped his coffee mug onto the counter, his good arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, crushing the space between them. He buried his face in her neck, breathing her in deeply, entirely stripping away the armor he wore for the rest of the world. He didn't need a contract to claim her. She had just handed him the pen, and as his lips brushed against the pulse point on her neck, hot and desperate, Lydia knew the dragon hadn't trapped her in the tower. She had chosen to lock the door herself. That's the explosive conclusion to Lydia and Dominic's story. If your heart was pounding during that warehouse shootout, or if you swooned when she finally burned the contract, smash that like button right now. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have walked out that door, or would you have stayed with Dominic? Share this video with your friends who love dark, gritty mafia romance with zero toxic cliches. And please, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so I can bring you even more intense, grounded storytelling. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.